For many years before the ability to track or record a lot of animals came from looking at models, and this is kind of the set of canonical sets of things that people played with. This is the simplest one of all, I guess, is one where you think of a fish, and it has three things it cares about in life. It doesn't want to hit anybody, so there's a repulsion distance that it cares about. It wants to be aligned with the other fish. Not clear why, but this is something that is often assumed, and that they don't want to be left alone. And if you play with the parameters of these three numbers of what's the distance that they would like to be in with respect to the other one, you can get these cool-looking different kinds of behaviors. And you can simulate them and get very fancy stuff like this group of simulated fish here, where there's a group of knowledgeable fish that want to go to the right, and at some point they magically manage to make the rest of the crowd go with them and flow in the right direction. So it turns out that a lot of the fish in nature haven't read the papers, or at least they didn't care for them that much. And so this is the brave effort of Roy Alpaz, who's around, so you can find him later if you want and talk to him about it, to set this thing up in my lab quite some time ago. And this is kind of looking at adult zebrafish swimming together, and then tracking their behavior. It was very clear that if you look at their trajectories, that they have very stereotypical phases of acceleration and deceleration, which if you actually go and monitor over time, you can see that these are very clear and stereotypical things that you can even fit functionally with different things. But most interestingly, maybe that is the fact that you can actually see that these are correlated with, if you look at the angle or the heading of the fish, these turns tend to go together with acceleration and deceleration phases. And then if you try and ask, what are the fish doing based on what we know from all the models, it turns out that the sensible thing to do, or the best thing we managed to do, is to build kind of a receptive field model for fish, in which each fish is looking at the neighborhood. It kind of looks, it has kind of everything around it. It gives weights to different parts of this pizza, if you will, and it's kind of weigh the velocity of each of the other fish it might see in different places and different time. So it does a complicated spatial temporal calculation on the surrounding that every ganglion cell is doing, or every visual cell is doing. And if you actually play with that, you can now start asking, okay, if I look now at a group of fish, can I kind of, this is overlaid map of the calculation that we think the fish are doing, kind of from training on a lot of data, and this is all going to try to look at held out data to try and predict how well we can capture their behavior when we actually combine two kinds of models, one for these acceleration modes and one for deceleration modes, which are very different in terms of the kind of calculation it does on the neighbors. And this is the fit between the data and the model, and the pink phases are where the fish actually accelerate, and you can see we get what is usually considered to be a very satisfactory fit in terms of the actual trajectory and the prediction of the model from knowing about what the other fish are doing. In fact, though, so this is kind of summary of the different sizes of groups in terms of the correlation between the actual trajectory and what we predict. But if you clean what you know just from the fact that fish have momentum and there's friction in water, then the fit is less impressive, although it's still pretty good. And you get, for different population sizes, different numbers in terms of how much you can predict just if you had the model that was based only on the social part of just knowing about the other fish. Other things that have to do with sensory information, which in this case is basically where are the walls of the arena and the lights. And if you actually take both into account, you gain more. So this is there's some redundancy between these two things, but it's not immediately clear how to distinguish what they know by themselves and what they know from what the other fish are doing. Moreover, if you do this with fish that are hungry, or fish and they are hoping that there'll be a food around, or fish that have eaten so they're relaxed, it seems like the kind of calculation of the receptive fields that we need to take into account are changed. And so this is a formidable venue, and there's a lot to be done in terms of trying to model this mechanistic structure of what the fish are doing. But at some point we stopped and asked ourselves, why would they do this? I mean, this is kind of an assumption about the computational complexity of the fish. Maybe we're setting them short because we tend to eat them. And kind of maybe it's time to start asking, what would be the sensible thing to do if you had no computational limit? So this was the time for a little bit of theory. So because we thought, collective behavior is fun and foraging is also interesting, maybe we should put the two of them together. No need to explain why foraging is relevant. We just heard about this. And there's a lot of different aspects to think about from how different animals do this in different contexts. And these are some of my favorite plots of different kinds of this. But of course, if you think about this more generally, foraging is a strategy for solving many kind of search problems, not necessarily just walking around. So even just kind of thinking about how you view things or look for objects, or if you want to think of general learning mechanism, that also would be relevant. So the common way to think maybe about the how to do foraging in many cases goes back to chemotaxis. So this is basically computing the local gradient of something you care about, and this is so easy or relatively easy that even E. coli do this. This is a picture of one E. coli that has eaten too much GFP. And then you can see the trajectory it does looking for the sugar that it likes here. And it does this, what's called tumble and run, where the direction that it takes is kind of a random draws that, and they will take long runs or short runs depending on whether they go up the gradient or not. So even bacteria can do this. And they can do this in really amazing settings. This is just for fun. I had to show this. This is an experiment in which nutrients have been put in some small plastic bowl that they exploded at time 0. So this is, you see the marking of how the nutrients actually, because of turbulence, flow in the box. And in bottom here in the blue is the actual markers of the bacteria. And you can see how they do an amazing job of tracking where the food that is, and they do this remarkably well. So chemotaxis works really wonderfully when there's a lot of food around. It doesn't work so well in two other scenarios, which is what I want to talk about. One is when there's noise or a lot of turbulence, when it's clear that your estimates are very noisy or limited or corrupted, depending on the degree of the noise, of course. And the other is that what do you do when there is a source, but it's very far and very weak? So, of course, you could try and compute the gradient, but in order to even sense something which is reliable to get the right direction would usually take a lot of time. So while this would work at the end of time, maybe that's not the best thing you should do. And so we thought about this for a while, and we came about this really cool paper that was mentioned before, from Vergasola and company about the idea for foraging they called infotaxis. And the idea was basically that, just like the bacteria is computing the gradient of how to go up a gradient to look for food, maybe you can look for stuff, and instead of looking, if you can't do the gradient, maybe you should go to the place that will give you most information about the world. So maybe rather than just looking for food, you should become smart. Thought that this will give some happiness among the crowd, but apparently you don't care about food. Anyhow, so this is a scientific proof that it's good to be smart in order to look for this weak source. The idea is that in every step, they should try and know more about the world, which we can quantify by the distribution, how much they don't know about the location of the source. So there's some probability distribution that each agent here now holds in its brain about where it thinks the food might be. And at every point in time, it tries to know more and more about where it is. And so the entropy of the distribution is a measure of how much you don't know. And again, the strategy is to try to make a move that will gain you information. So just to be concrete for a second, we're going to think about there's one source somewhere that is kind of emitting particles in random directions. And it's a weak source, so you can't just compute this and get the gradient. You get a thing every now and then, so the rate is relatively low. You can think about wind, that will affect how things will diffuse. And then you can basically compute the probability of hitting something in different places around the arena. And then at every step, our agent, which is marked here by the gray circle, can decide, so if it moves, if it's lucky, then it actually hit the source, or life is good, then it's going to eat, or it's going to smell something, or sense a particle that was emitted, or it sees nothing. And the strategy of what to do now is to try and make a move that will maximize the following things. So this is the difference in entropy, or how much information you've gained as the agent if you went from position R to position R prime. And that's the expected gain in information is a combination of two things. So one is, this is if you're actually going to hit the source, then this is you gain all the information and also eat. So this is the probability that the source is actually in this particular place. And if you're not hitting the source, there's the probability of not hitting it, and then there's some probability you'll smell or sniff something, and there's a probability you won't sense anything. So this is kind of the two terms of what the future might hold for you, and there's different combination of how much information you'll gain in each case. And then at each step, you will update your probability distribution of the world and keep on going. So this works remarkably well. This is the example from Vergassola. So the source is in the middle in black. This is the starting point of the agent, and then this is the trajectory it does when there's no wind. This is what it does when there is wind. And this is, they showed this actually quite close to being efficient, and also looks so cool and similar to the trajectories of insects flying towards food that everybody was extremely happy about this, including us. So we thought maybe we should put this together. We should think about what groups could do. And maybe we should think about how groups could use this notion of getting information, because aside from your own sensory information, there's what the other group, members of your group or other creatures that you see that are doing. Maybe you can get information from them. So there are two extreme cases that are going to be the not so interesting ones, and then we're going to talk about the interesting one. The not so interesting case is, well, what if there's just two of these agents running around, and they're both doing infotaxis? They don't care about each other, they ignore one another, and they both do this spiral little thing, and then they'll find the food eventually. And if you're going to ask, how fast will they find it? Or, well, now there's two, so on average they'll find it a little bit faster. But basically you'll get the same kind of thing, just repeated over and over again. The other case is the case when they actually have cell phones, and they talk to one another, and they have a committee meeting, and they decide at every step from all the information, you're going to go there and I'm going to go there, and this is the optimal thing to do. So if you do this joint infotactic thing, you get this clear, interesting structure in which they split the world in a particular way. And of course, this is the best thing they could do as a pair, but it's obvious also that this is very expensive in terms of communication and kind of the setting up the way they might do this. So here's what we call the Socialtaxis thing, in which we actually going to look, what you wanted to do at every step is to actually gain a lot of knowledge about the world. And also, so you want to minimize the entropy about what you don't know about the world, and some function of your relation to the other agents. So, so this will be the first term will be basically so agent I will try to minimize its own entropy, and some function that some, let's call it G, which will be the some function of its relation to the other group members, and there's going to be some conversion rate of how you weight these two things, of whether how much do you care about having your own knowledge versus your relation to the other agents. And then we can play with different versions. Technically this is kind of you can think of this as minimizing some kind of free energy. So the simple thing we tried first is what everybody's doing from the literature, these mechanistic models in which fish care about the distance between them and the orientation. And so if you run this, you get trajectories in which they kind of move together because they kind of like to be close to one another. And they'll find the food, and it turns out they'll do a little bit better than the case where they're independent, but not by much. The really interesting case came when we said, what if what they wanted to do is to learn a lot about the world, but they also wanted to know stuff which is different from what the other one knows. So if we think about these two agents now, we're going to measure the overlap about their knowledge of the world by the Kullback-Leibler divergence between the two probability distributions. So we're assuming, and we'll get rid of this a little bit later, that they kind of know what the other one, the internal model of the world that the other one has, so they still kind of have some kind of communication, complicated communication between them. But this is much more limited in the sense that everybody's going to do their own thing, bless you, and their goal is to minimize their own entropy and to try and be as different as possible from the other. And then what we get here for we did an example with beta equal 10 in terms of how they weigh these two things. you get these trajectories that are now, again, it seems like they're pushing one another relatively in space. And so if you compare all four cases to one another, the independent agents, the distance-based social taxes, the information-based social taxes, and this full cooperation mode, you get what you can already see qualitatively different kind of behaviors of the group in space. And if you try to quantify this over the strength of this, how strong is this coupling, how much weight you give to the wish to be different from everybody else, this gives very interesting results. So this is all normalized to how fast they would find this when there are independent agents. In the bottom here, this is the case of the full cooperation when they make a decision by committee. This is what you do if you do this distance-based social taxes with different values of the coupling, this beta term, and the arrow bars are over many, many realizations. And this is what you get from this information social taxes, which very quickly goes very close to the optimal behavior. In fact, if you go even further up to here, it gets even better. By the way, this is doing a very kind of get a feeling of how this is actually going on. What's going on is that if we are now going to plot, in addition to the trajectories, the actual probability map that they form for themselves, and you can see some about how they converge. We also thought at some point that it might be good if instead of trying to be different from one another, they wanted to be close to one another and average their knowledge about the world. It seems like the most sensible thing to do because this is a noisy and hard to sample environment. It turns out this is a catastrophic strategy, and this is the kind of a plot of what's going on. They become obsessed with being different from one another, and they don't seem to go for anything about getting more information about the world. And this is basically, it doesn't matter how strong the coupling is, as soon as you make them try to be similar to one another, it's kaput. So, in terms of get a sense, where is this coming from? If we actually look at the progression in time, which reminds me, how much time do I have?
We have 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes, perfect.
13 minutes, yeah.
So if we now look at the how this thing behaves as a function of the time, this is now the distance between the two agents, and this is the time steps. This is for the different coupling values, so beta equal is the independent case. And this is the distance to the source. And what you can see is that what happens due to the coupling is that they start by pushing away from one another, kind of covering the space in a more efficient way. But then they converge back very quickly. Because once you play these two things one against the other, you can only be as different from the other guy in a way that makes sense. I mean, if you were to go run away and never stop, you won't get much in terms of your knowledge about the source. So this balance between these two things, get them to do this, and there's this very interesting kink here in terms of their relation to the source. Again, they're getting away from it at the beginning just to cover the space better, and then they'll converge. If we go to larger groups, it looks even cooler, I would say. This is now groups of 30 agents doing this, so you can look at their trajectories, and you can see that the way that they're going to find things is very, very different. This is snapshots over time of the movie I just showed you to get a feeling for what's going on. So at the beginning, they all start from this purple point and they start going south, but at some point, the repellent force of this social taxis thing, they make them disperse. And not only are they going to find it faster, what's really cool is that once the first one actually hit the target, everybody else is also not that far, right? So you don't need to get them to come and join the party. They're already there. So it's good for the first one and for everyone else as well. If we sum this over different group sizes just to get a feeling, so this is now the curves as a function of the coupling strength for 5, 10, up to 30 agents. And if we actually look at how this scales with the population size, you see there's a very clear gap. This is now 2 examples of the independent case and the beta equal 10, which is just a number we picked. But you see there's kind of this logarithmic decline in terms of how fast they'll find it, just because there are more of them in the independent case, and the fact that you consistently gain by trying to keep your individuality. In terms of how much information they gain, this is the flow, the rate of entropy gain as a function of time. At the beginning, they don't gain much compared to the independent case. So this is the actual entropy curves, how much they don't know, and you see this actually separates around here. So this is the difference in entropy, how much more you gain because you're trying to be individual. At the beginning, again, you don't gain much, you maybe even lose a little bit, but then this kicks in and you become super smart. So now we thought, okay, fine, this was, it's clear that this is working really well, but we were really troubled about the fact that our agents were sharing their probability map of the world. I mean, it's very nice and it's a cool algorithm, but it's hard to imagine that animals actually do this. So we tried different versions of trying to make this more and more biological. So here are the summary of these for different coupling strengths. So again, the independent agents are here in gray. And then the red thing is the thing we just saw. This is the fact that they share all their knowledge about their internal model of the world. And then we tried three different versions actually of trying to ask, trying to become more biological. The first one was, what if instead of sharing the full map, they just shared the local peak of their map? So the maximum, the most likely value of where they think the food might be at this point. And this is what we get from the blue curve over here. So this is even better than sharing the full map. So this is, if you basically, so this requires them to assume that there's some Gaussian width to what the other one thinks, but as soon as they do that and they do DKL based just on the central point of where the mean of the estimate of the other one is, that's super efficient. But then we said, well, this still requires them to give some information to one another. What if they didn't share any information? So let's try and do inference. What if they try to infer something about what the other one thinks? And this requires them to make one very important assumption, which is that the other one is similar to them in terms of the things it likes, because if you hate carrots and the other one loves carrots, that's not going to end well for you. So, so they have to make that assumption, and then we tried different versions of inference. Some of them are surprisingly simple. So if you do full map inference, that's really hard, of course. So there's a lot of noise in the inference, and you're really susceptible to what kind of inference algorithm you choose. So we do a little bit better, but not by a lot. If all you try to do is just to infer something about the peak location of the other one, this is much better. So, of course, this now becomes the issue of what kind of theory of mind you want to give your agents to infer things about the other ones, which we've been playing with quite a bit. But the reference point again is how well you can do if they actually share this knowledge of the world. The last thing I think I want to show you is I'm trying to think again more closely to, but yes?
Sorry, just a naive question. Why the full map sharing performs worse than peak location sharing in the beginning?
So we wondered a lot about this. Thank you for the question. And what is going on is that at the beginning, bless you, your initial, the map that you have suffers in a sense from the very sporadic way you sense the world. So your estimate of the world is not that good. And in particular, a lot of the issues of the spatial distribution, there's a lot of the stuff there that is noisy, and if you had more data, you'll figure out this is not really the case. If you just have the peak and you assume a Gaussian thing, this is actually better at the beginning than what you would do later on. And this is really why just sharing the center works so well. But we can decide whether we like this measure or not in terms of the algorithm. So as a kind of maybe the last step towards the thinking of how these models could relate to what animals might want to do in life. So this is now an issue of we played or what we measured up until now is how fast someone in the group finds it, and then we assume it's going to call everybody else to come join the party. And so we asked, well, there's two things to ask you. One is, what if you only care about yourself? Shame on you. Or what do you do if you're not coupled to the other ones the same way they're coupled to you? It's you have in different position in life, you different kinds of commitments. So what if you have different kinds of beta between the two agents? So we're going to look at different values of the coupling from 1 to 2, and we're going to play the two combinations. So I picked 3 values of 2 to 1, and then we're going to play with the values from 1 to 2, and it turns out that it basically doesn't really matter if the other one is coupled strongly or weakly to you. The best thing you can do for the benefit of the group is to trying to be as different as possible from them. So even if they really like you, or even they a little bit want to be different for you, you should try to be as different as possible. The other one is, what if you again care about yourself? So this is now trying to ask, what's the probability that you're gonna find the food as a function of the. So again, I'm going to pick 3 values just to make it easier to see the plot for the coupling between 2 to 1. So again, weak, medium, and super strong from the other one to you. And you can play with how much you want to be different from the other one. And here, it seems like there are optimal values of where you want to be, which range somewhere between so this is maybe an extreme case when it's completely coupled to the other one. But somewhere between 0 and 1, there's a kind of an optimal number of where you want to be in terms of if you only cared about yourself. So, just to sum up, so seems like this social tax is based on trying to be different from the other ones, trying to be an individual, is the best thing you can do for the group. You can now take the political implication of this any way that you want. In terms of the how this actually works, what happens is that this balance between the two things make the agents cover the space in an efficient manner, but they also kind of don't become completely sacrifice themselves for everybody. So this is kind of a constrained coverage of the space. And again, this asymmetric coupling and the individuality, or thinking about being opportunistic or just a good team member, we're going to have an effect on how you can do this and how you might infer stuff. So now we can go back to asking things about real animals and other search domains, and thinking of diversity as a principle for what groups might want to do. In terms of real animals, we played a little bit with the data of the real fish. It didn't seem like they read the Infotaxis or Socialtaxis paper either. And then we thought, okay, maybe they're not knowledgeable enough. So we tried the different games with people who played video games of tracking things when they played with other agents around. It turns out that even if you're one of the authors of the Socialtaxis paper, you don't do Socialtaxis when you play against someone else. I don't know what this means for their commitment to the project. We played with other search domains, which actually it seems to be very useful in different kinds of problems we've been looking at, which is kind of cool. And this notion of maybe the power of the group is in the diversity. I mean, of course, many people have made that point before. This is another, I think, nice version of seeing this. And this is just the people who are involved in all of this. This is the lab. The names that are in boldface are the people whose work I mentioned today. Roy did all the fish stuff and a lot more that I didn't have time to show you. And Adi and mainly Udi, this was his PhD, worked on the first part of his PhD was on social taxes before he went to look at the population codes. And this is the people we collaborated with, and this is all the people who gave us money. And thank you for your time and attention.
Questions? Okay. Linoy?
Wow, that was beautiful.
Hi, Linoy.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
I'm curious if you try to play with what happens if some of the individuals in the populations are more reliable than others.
Are more
Reliable than others?
reliable in what way?
The information they give you is...
So what if they cheat or they're just not that accurate?
Or just, right.
No, we haven't. That's cool. We'll do that.
So if you take your agents and you compute the receptive field for them, for the different algorithms,
Mm-hmm.
does it look anything like your zebrafish receptive field or other behavior that's been described in the literature?
So I'm not sure. I mean, the receptive field in here is basically the sense of their model of where they think the food might be.
No, I mean,
So
assume that this is a real fish.
Oh, okay.
And now just do the same analysis
so now if I
for
limit
the
their-
fish
their-
and see if it looks like anything like the real fish.
Yeah. So it didn't look anywhere near. What we try to do is we try to make the agents use the receptive field of the fish. And it seems like this was working not too badly, but wasn't as nice as this, so this is kind of was left on the.
So it could be an approximation that.
Maybe, but this we didn't follow this enough to make a conclusive statement here.
Okay, to follow the schedule. Okay, we move on to the panel. So we will.
We can come
I
later.
ask all our speakers to. We will set up some chairs here, but everyone can.